So I just wanted to hear anybody's thoughts on the whether we actually even have a partner or are going to have a partner in a few years in Mexico to deal with. In other words, if Mexico, I mean, it's not going to become Somalia, but if it turns into something more like Colombia, then where are we?
I'll just say quickly, because I really think this is Julie's question. But quickly on that, one of the things that has bothered me a little bit is the emphasis on that our border security is dependent on Mexican-U.S. Involvement and working together. That is absolutely essential. But what we're not hearing is our responsibility on our side of the border to assure that our infrastructure, our technology, our personnel, our mission, our policies are all in sync with making sure the border is secure. That is what we're not hearing. So while we applaud ATF efforts and ICE efforts to take care of guns and cash going south, what are we doing to make sure that long-term we are building what we need to keep a secure border? So to some extent, I think, the issue of Mexico, it falls on us in the end to secure our own border. So, to the extent Mexico is important, it absolutely is. But from my point of view, we have to focus on ourselves and take responsibility for our own border.
I would certainly agree with that. I think we have a partner now. I don't know if we're going to have a partner in a few years. I think that Merida is a disappointment. I think that the efforts that the U.S. made, and given that sometimes, different personalities or other things can be more effective in their home countries, the efforts that were made in Plan Colombia and the follow-through that the U.S. government had in Plan Colombia compared to kind of what we're seeing in Merida, I think it's a little bit disappointing. And I think we need to kind of redouble our efforts to make sure we're really pushing so that we are going to have a partner. I think it was pretty shocking. It was either a year and a half ago when some of the kind of higher level folks were accused and found of guilty of corruption, and it's folks that
in Mexico.
In
really?
Mexico.
Imagine that.
No, but I mean people that that DOJ leadership had worked for and knew for many years. Folks I'd been in 20, 30, 40 meetings with. And it's not surprising, but it's troubling. And so the question is there going to be kind of stabilization going forward, or is there not? And I think we're at a real turning point. I think you're right. You see the cartels are partnering in different ways. They're getting more authority. And we very well could be, as Secretary of State said, at a negative turning point with the narco-insurgency and being where Colombia was 20 years ago, but not coming out of it.
Right.
So it is, I think that it's not clear yet which way it's going to go, but it is troubling. I will say that the change in the extradition laws, I personally believe, has been one of the most important things to make some real progress, to actually get some of these leaders out of Mexico. If we did not have the ability to do that, as we didn't kind of previously in closer to real time, we'd be in much deeper trouble.
Any?
I have one standard question that women in Homeland Security always asks, and that is, and I guess I'll direct this to you, Julie, because I think we know how Janice feels. But if you were the Secretary of Homeland Security right now, and the big caveat, and all the politicians were not here, what do you think would secure the border the best or the most effectively in the short term, and then in the long term?
And write this down, because 2013 we made that question for real.
I was thinking I'm smart enough never to take that a very unwinnable job. But, I think Janice's point at looking at how do we deploy the National Guard kind of smarter is something I do in the first instance. If you think about the surge that we've had overseas, we need a surge to protect our border, a real surge, and not something that is a surge in name only. So I would really kind of look at some of the things that have worked and kind of pilot those out, and then try to figure out, is there some technology, infrastructure that can be more helpful? What are we doing with the most basic things? With the license plate readers, are they out there everywhere? Are we tracking, is the same car going through? Are we tracking, is the same license plate going through? If this highway is such an area of concern, what are we doing to kind of to remove it as a major trafficking route.
I'm gonna stand up because I don't know if you all can hear back there. So for some of you who might recognize me or you're like, why does she look familiar? I'm Michelle Mordeza. I used to be the staff director of the Homeland Security, House Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee, and I'm delighted that Jeff Ashford, who's one of my former colleagues, is also here. So, and it's really important because that Jeff is here too, because he brings a tremendous institutional knowledge in terms of funding for border security. He's been at this business now for what, 18 years, Jeff? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm dating you. But what's really, your comments are really so interesting to me and so right on. Both of you are just really leaders in this area, and I really commend you and thank you for your leadership. From the Hill perspective, from the appropriations perspective, which is very narrow, I would add, in many different ways. And I've been off the Hill for 4 years now, but we just threw money at the border. And even as you referenced in this film, another $600 million in border security just went out the door a month or so ago. But where are we at in terms? We're certainly not. It's not a money issue. There's just an insatiable appetite and an insatiable desire to continue to fund border security so it's safer. So your point, Janice, about having a coordinated and synchronized effort is one that truly resonates with me, and it was one of my major frustrations on Capitol Hill, that while I had responsibility for the Homeland Security subcommittee, and then Jeff and I also worked on the Treasury Postal Service and General Government Subcommittee, so we're really dating ourselves, which had legacy customs underneath it. That was one piece of the pie. And we, as hard as we tried, could never get coordination across the other appropriations subcommittees in order to have a consolidated look at border security. And now that I'm on the outside, what's even more frustrating is I see these great programs that are out there, and you mentioned gun tracing. You're right, on its own, tracing all the guns out there, it is not going to solve it. But if you coordinate that effort with other programs that are operated by ATF and DEA and others down there, then you can really solve this problem. I guess that's the statement. It's also the question is, and really for both of you, you clearly, Janice, have an idea in mind how we can do that coordination and synchronize our efforts along the border. And then also, Julie, from your perspective, having been in a leadership role in Homeland Security, how do you break down those barriers with the Department of Justice, not just here in DC in the headquarters level, but out in the fields where we're working with state, local, federal law enforcement, not only our side of the border, but also with the Mexican authorities? That was a really long-winded question, but it just really struck a chord with me on here we are 20-something years later, and we still haven't secured our borders despite the billions of dollars that we put there.
Well, for me, I think one of the really important places to start is with a recognition from the very top that it's an important issue and a priority issue. You start there, and then you go second to a mission that's really about the stewardship of our country. And whether the Secretary's position is political or not, it's an issue of stewardship of our Homeland Security that I think is extremely important. We have had secretaries who have taken that seriously like that. So I think if you take it from that point of view, then you plug in the fact that you need a strategy that's holistic. How does Border Patrol, that's 100 miles into the border for its jurisdiction, interact with ICE? And then what are your goals for that interaction? And where does your strategy need to be when you know the flexibility with which the cartels and the illegal smugglers, coyotes move? And how do you place that? I think there are two things that strike me very clearly that are not there that need to be. One is this underpinning that I discovered doing these films, that we do not have sufficient federal law enforcement on federal lands. Most of Arizona and those borderlands is federal lands, or it's the Tohono O'odham Reservation. Almost all of it is. The only private property you have is to the very east side in Douglas, over where Mr. Krentz was murdered. That's the only area that's private property. All the rest is public property. Why is it then that the biggest problem is in Arizona? There has been a long-standing problem in Arizona of Department of Interior much less Department of Agriculture and Forest lands, much less so, but Department of Interior primarily, exacting a huge price out of the Border Patrol for operating on those lands. Now, Secretary Chertoff tried very, very hard to overcome that. There was an agreement in place. The agreement sits there. On paper, it is there, but it is not operating on the ground. If you talk to the Natural Resources Subcommittee, the Republican ranking member, there are hundreds of thousands of dollars that the Border Patrol is being made to pay every year for realigning or bettering re-improving the land that they use when they chase after smugglers and of any kind, for the damage that they do to the land. The exaction is not coming out of the smugglers themselves. So Department of Interior has very strict rules about Border Patrol working on their land. Border Patrol, as a result, does not work those lands like they should, and there's sort of this impasse that happens. That's why you hear this undercurrent of me talking about very little federal law enforcement on federal land. That problem absolutely has to be solved, or none of this will be solved. The other problem is, whatever anybody thinks of fencing, whatever anybody thinks, the fact of the matter is, even the Drug Enforcement Agency said that Nogales is a particularly bad spot because there's no infrastructure east or west. The Coronado Mountains, the Huachuca Mountains, and the Coronado National Forest sit to the east of Nogales, about 26 miles away. There is nothing for 26 miles from Nogales all the way over to the Coronado National Forest. There is no fencing at all. This is where hundreds of illegal trails are. These are hard places to access for the Border Patrol, both because of the geography and because of the rules in place to chase after in those areas. So you have no infrastructure and you have little ability to get there. These are really strong problems. You look at something I mentioned in my comments that might have gotten lost, and I promise, Julie, I'll shut up in a second, was that the National Guard surge that happened in 2006 to 2008 under President Bush in Yuma, what they were doing in Yuma was building fencing alongside of all the interdiction they were doing every day and the life-saving they were doing on the ground every day. They were building fencing along Yuma. It's all sand dunes out there. That's where Star Wars was filmed. It's all sand dunes out there. So if you go out there, you'll see from the road on I-8, you can see the fencing. Tucson never happened. Tucson area, that sector which goes south to Nogales, and to the west is Tohono O'odham, is the biggest push right now of that illegal activity. When the fencing is there, it seems to make a difference. It also makes a huge difference with trash. Tons and tons of trash is not left behind where the fencing is. The trash goes around the fencing. You're saving the environment and you're cutting down on the smuggling activity. So smuggling right now is being pushed into that area where there's no infrastructure. So you put those combined things together of lack of access to those Department of Interior lands in any real way and lack of infrastructure, you have a serious problem. I think if you begin to solve that with a surge in place, you have something that can really happen. That forces the Border Patrol, Department of Interior to really get it together and make it happen. I think that's a real key there. So that's my long-winded answer to your long-winded question.